All right, everyone. Welcome to what most of us have been looking forward to for 6 months, the H1 2022 forecast. Now traditional, every 6-month look at the space weather and the world, such as it is. So, Austin, welcome aboard.
Hey.
All right. And if you are listening to this or watching it, we're recording this as a webinar for premium members as well. So there'll be at the end of the forecast. Typically what we do and what we're going to do this time is no different. We're going to look over how we went and how H2 2021 went. Although I do think it has 1 or 2 surprises remaining for us, which we may care to speculate on because it's still not the end of the year yet. And then we're going to look at H1, and then we're going to do that and situate that in a discussion around how we frame what's happening and the sort of importance of personal frameworks and how they can be helpful in navigating what's happening. And then we'll do questions. So that if you're listening along rather than you're on the call with us, then that's how it's going to roll. So let's look back at H1 then, H2 2021. What are your thoughts now?
I had some pretty, as we say, I found November to have a number of satisfactorily unpleasant things in it. You know, I'd been looking at November since the beginning of last year as being one of the ugliest sort of month length portion of the year. And we got all sorts of unpleasant things as a result, right? So I was, I wouldn't say I was happy with that, right? But one can be satisfied with something unpleasant. And as I believe I spoke about, I know I talked about it, that there wasn't any sort of uptick in December to really bring things back onto a happy high road. We're just sort of in the momentum or the inertia from November, right? So it depends. We could look at November from a variety of different parameters. We could look at it with, how should we say, lockdown security going back into effect. We could look at it from unhappy economics. We could look at it from the literal plague of scorpions that happened in Egypt. Like, it's just, not a great month.
A little bit on the nose. Yeah, pretty wild. We're both keeping notes for the kind of like November turning point, because one of the things, and I think it was one of the better calls of the H, is something you said that whatever July is going to set up what November is about. And July, we got the announcement of vaccine passports in France, and then November was defined by that story. So as I go and get the battery for this GoPro, which is just down on the ground, because I'm actually quite organized today, you talk to the team.
Okay, yeah. And so the reason, what connected July and November was basically Mars coming in to reactivate or to stress the Saturn-Uranus square, which was present for all of 2021 and will be present for all of 2022. It's this sort of ongoing or literally fixed tension that other planets activate from time to time. And so it's interesting, Gordon used the term turning point, and it's not really a turning point in the sense that it's just another delivery of the same. We had, whenever Mars is in a 180, 0 or 90 degree angle, hard angle to that Saturn-Uranus, we get events that just move this sort of story of fixed crisis onwards. But it doesn't resolve them, right? Like November didn't resolve anything. It just ratcheted up the tensions that were already extant, right?
Yeah.
And so that's one of the really important things to get about 2022 is that it's just 2021 part 2. It doesn't, it's the same story, which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
There's no, how should we say, there's no like none of the forces in contention in 2021 is about to have a sudden and total victory where now history will go in that direction, right? It's just it's the same tension that's ramped up and mellowed down every couple months. And, that's the entire rest of 2022. And that story goes on until the first quarter of 2023. And then we enter something really different. And I don't think it will be something really different that is that can be properly outlined by sort of trying to calculate the odds of who will be victorious and who will be defeated last year or this year. It's just astrology. It looks like a really different thing. It looks like rather than contests being resolved, contests being dissolved. Gotcha. Or just moved into a totally different area.
Cool, we're back. Sorry, I had some technical difficulties. By turning point, I was obviously using an Armstrong term because it was actually one of the moments in H2 where they lined up, where July was a bit of an issue and then November was a major turning point. And I think, like, for my money, it really, we spoke about this, and it's one of the kind of things that I think has been borne out, that what's going on at the moment is impacting the EU worse and first. And that's definitely going to continue next year, which we'll get to at some point. But that was it was evident that was definitely what had, I think, been picked up in July with the passports in France, because November was the announcements that in Austria you will be imprisoned if you don't allow the state into your body and so on. And so
one important sort of timing note about that was what I looked at November was different about November versus July or January when we had that same Mars activation of the Saturn-Uranus square, was that November was the first time we got an eclipse input into that same system. And it was actually it was the day after the lunar eclipse that Austria made its announcement, right? So you can see that that extra, we got the Mars-Saturn-Uranus by themselves were enough to give us a plague of scorpions. But it was that eclipse input ratcheting up to the next level. Yeah. And that's the first eclipse input. And then we basically get another couple sets of that throughout 2022. So same, but with eclipses. And so our first taste of same, but with eclipses was the second half of November this year, 2021. Yeah.
So it's basically, I mean, that to me, because obviously I'm focusing on this being trapped in this country very closely, I feel like that's November was the defining space weather of the half, right? And in particular that it's going to tell you in July what it's going to do in November, I think, is the story of that. Is there anything else about H2? I mean, bearing in mind, there's some like Christmas Eve fun coming. And again, in Armstrong's model, the Ukraine is still in play from a war perspective between now and the end of the year, potentially at Christmas, because Orthodox Christmas is January 6th. So it's actually quite a good time to invade non-Orthodox places in and around Christmas. So there's still at least one more fresh hell card to play, I think, for 2021. But is there anything else that we spoke about at the end of June that's worth revisiting as we head into the H1 stuff?
Oh, I would just say that, again, looking at November is sort of the template of what that Saturn-Uranus square looks like with eclipse input. The statistics aren't out yet, but generally speaking, another wave of, we call it economic pain that was inevitable because it was delayed, should have most likely hit in November. We'll see that much more clearly, in a couple of months, in whatever statistics. But, that I think that's going to be another characteristic of the eclipse amplified Uranus-Saturn periods in 2022, where it's like the cost of 2020, the flocks of chickens coming home to roost, if you will, in various ways.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I think there's a lot of that in in 2022. And also another thing,
a lot of chickens in the sky.
Yeah, a lot of flying chickens. And also, one of the things, and we've kind of, I remember talking about it heading into 2021, but it's more so the case now because the pandemic narrative is the right way of describing that, is a 3-year story: last year, this year, and next year. And in one way or the other, not that we ever go back to normal, reaches important conclusions next year. And so one of the things is we look at the space weather for the first half, and there are some white knuckle parts coming, but there are also some parts that look quite good. And
oh yeah, there's some, well, as of my like 2-sentence summary of 2022 is basically, it's like 2021, except the good parts are better and the bad parts are worse.
Oh, I like that.
But it's very similar character.
Yeah. But what I wanted to kind of, because I get to be the Austin on this show, because I get to do go even darker than you and say, listen, the good configurations, whilst good, can only lift up from where the world is. So whilst some of them look really, really good, it's in a situation of like, well, it's really, really good space weather in a dire situation. So I don't want people to have like Pollyanna hopes about certain parts of the year that look better than the worst parts, because it's good that comes immediately after bad. In the same way, you get a sunny day after a tornado, you've still just had a tornado.
And so one thing that makes that point really clearly is some of the best configurations of 2022 happen nearly simultaneously with the worst. And so, you have to, so we've got like, if we have time and be like, oh, this section of time has both, then you need to, as the zodiac does, you spatialize it, right? Oh, things are great during this time. This is worse than ever, and this is better than ever, right? And so you get so it's a mixed bag, but the bag actually has separate compartments, like both parts of where it's 2 bags that both open, and have you're delighted to see what's in one, and and dread fills you at the sight of what the other contains. Right?
I had a friend at school who would be like that, because he would leave his apple in the bag and it would rot, but he could put his books in another compartment. Because I was going to go with like, it's like a hiking backpack with a bladder, because like the good space weather is actually really watery. So so you've put live scorpions in one part of your hiking backpack, but you also have a bladder of champagne.
yeah. Or I don't know, it's like a drinking game where half the time you take shots of the finest liquor you've ever had, and then for the other half of the drinking game it's just shots of day-old urine, right? Nice. But the game is both, but they're not mixed together, they're separate shots.
That's true. That's even better. Okay, that's going to be really interesting to find an image for the post page. Cool. So in 2022 in general, this is probably other than the urine mezcal drinking game, is one of the things you mentioned, which I quite like when we were sort of pre-discussing this episode, was 2022 is in many respects a story of Mars.
Yeah, especially, it is a story of Mars. I would say it doesn't quite get going until Q2, and then it doesn't stop going. Almost everything Mars does is very impactful during 2022. We get so during, it's beginning of March through most of April, we have Mars moves into Aquarius, which gives us Mars and Saturn together in Aquarius, squaring Uranus and the nodes. So it's Mars intersecting with that Saturn-Uranus story. And so again, like last year, a lot of our big moments were Mars intersecting with that. But as we say, and so, we can make certain blanket statements about Mars intersects with Saturn, Uranus, we get these kind of outputs, but there are different angles, right? And so this will be this Mars Saturn in Aquarius will be the first time we've seen that since April, May of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
We got a preview of Saturn in Aquarius, and Mars joined immediately. And so to think about this, we need to stop for a second and kind of redefine what Saturn-Uranus is about. Very simply, Saturn is the attempt to make order, and then Uranus is the challenges to that order, right? And that can be in chaotic or unexpected events just in the field, like in the environment that's in play, and it can be those who oppose the order, right? And so you have this sort of, especially with Saturn in Aquarius, Saturn is strong in Aquarius. That's one of the signs it traditionally rules. And what Saturn in the past, the last several iterations, you see Saturn's time in Aquarius trying to establish new rules, right? And so we have this tension between basically the establishment of new rules or boundaries, and then with Uranus, resistance to that, changes in the environment. And that can be, the physical, world climate environment, but that can also just be wherever the order is trying to be made. Sudden disruptions, sudden changes, unexpected developments that make those rules not work, or human resistance to said rules, right? And so this is like that. Things have changed. What should the rules be? No, we hate that, but what should they be? What shouldn't they be? Is really like, that's the structure of the last, of the last year, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And we can slot a lot of things into that. And so Mars, and so when Mars is with Uranus or with Saturn, we tend to see Mars amplifying and sort of being on the side of either rebellion or new order, right? And so, for example, the rather infamous January 6th that began 2021, that was the day that Mars entered Taurus, which is where Uranus, the rebellion, resistance, revolt is, right? And then our other two that we had in 2021, the Mars in Leo in Cancer, or excuse me, the Mars in Leo during July and Mars in Scorpio during November, intersected with both, but weren't clearly on one team or another, right? And so this Mars-Saturn together in Aquarius should be heavy-handed for Saturn. And then not too many months later, I believe it's shortly into Q3, then we have Mars in Taurus, right? So it's Mars with Uranus again, but this time with Rahu, the North Node, the Dragon's Head, the eclipse significator. And so we have kind of the same thing again, like once again, but with more feeling. And then as soon as Mars gets done with Taurus, it goes into Gemini, where we're going to get a retrograde that'll literally, it'll be Mars in Gemini from sort of mid third quarter of next year until the end of the first quarter of 2023. So that'll be it. That Mars will be it. And that we can talk about that more, but that Mars is very significant for the United States. That is where Mars was when the Declaration of Independence was signed. Whenever you get lots of Mars in that Gemini area, you have important things for the United States.
Yeah, which we will definitely get to in later on. Yeah.
And there's more too. I guess the one thing I left out there is that we have a period of Mars in Aries with Jupiter in Aries, right? And that's basically second half of Q2 or spring here in the States.
Yeah.
And that's a super triumphant, conquering, ambitious, bold combination. As I was telling you the other day, I've been spending a lot of time with older electional texts of, what is a good time to do a thing. And so when I was looking at that Mars Jupiter, I was like, oh boy, that would be such a good time to declare a short war, right? If I were, if I wanted to, expand the boundaries of my country, or, do a little quick operation to annex something. And then I was like, oh, well, that means it'll probably happen because it's a great time for it.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's, Mars is almost everything Mars does is pretty significant. Mars in Pisces, which is between the Mars-Saturn and the Mars-Jupiter should be pretty mellow. And the Mars in Capricorn, which happens early mid Q1, also not, I don't think extremely dramatic, but more than half of what Mars does next year is pretty impactful. Yeah. And then a lot of the other events will pivot around it.
Yeah, I think, and this can bring us back to the beginning of the year, one of what potentially we'll look at in retrospect as being one of the more important configurations is the Venus retrograde in Capricorn, because in a nutshell, Armstrong's view for next year is that it's worse than this year, which we knew anyway, but it's kind of the stuff we've already hit on: rising civil unrest, risk of war. What else have I got written there? Plague cycle actually turns up.
Yes. Go ahead.
So those are all the exciting things. But the other one, and this is his major turning point for the year, and it's one of the interesting ways where it kind of aligns with the astrology yet again, is towards the end of March is a major turning point. And what he said at his conference in November was that they're going to try and engineer a Great Depression sometime next year. And what's happened at the moment, if you actually read financially...
Do you really need to engineer that at this point?
Yeah, you do.
I mean, we were kind of due,
there's a correction
before
and there's
2020.
a Great Depression, right? And so this, you can tell it's going to be engineered because there are rats leaving the ship. So what happened at the end of 2019, and it made the press at the time, was there was a record number of CEOs and CFOs who left their positions. And Greg and I spoke about that on High Side Chats. That's happening again. So it's already making the news where a bunch of CMO and CEO type people have all left their positions before their contracts are up in the last month or so. So what became apparent, everyone left in 2019, and then you get the crash in the beginning of 2020. So his best guess is that a severe economic event is the story of Q1. And I just think about Venus retrograde in Capricorn as that kind of one, it's unpleasant, but it's a particular kind of unpleasantness of working out what it is you actually value in reference to structure and hierarchy and things that are traditionally valued. And so there's that the supply chain disruptions and all the rest of it that will come with a severe economic event makes you kind of look at a can of food with a different sense of value than you might have before, because you've been going to the store for a week and there's not that much in it, right? So I think there's some really interesting. It may turn out that if the model lines up well enough, that the severe economic event means that we end up with a low coming into the end of March, then it's sort of the story of Venus retrograde in Capricorn being one of the surprise hits of the season, I think. So that's the one I'm watching closest at the moment, because again, with this model, you kind of, not that you want this for anyone, but if we have a low going into the turning point at the end of March, it means that you end up, because it's a turning point, kind of climbing out of it until about mid 2023. Whereas if we go into the end of March on a high, then you're looking at capital controls and all this, a really unpleasant subsequent 18 months, which I just don't think is there in the space weather, right? So I look at it and go, I think Q1 is going to suck, is my scientific definition of it. And I'm just trying to pick, it is interesting at this point to speculate which of the sort of configurations might pick up that story, I guess.
So I won't say that I don't think I can say offhand where the most visible sort of chicken landing zone is, chicken roosting zone. But there's certainly some pressure points, right? And I'm thinking, and we can most likely, if it looks like that for the US, then that probably means that's going to be true of other of other countries, et cetera, et cetera. If we look at it, if we can find it in the EU, et cetera, et cetera. Just like if you're looking at birth charts, if you see something you can confirm an illness in the parent's chart by looking at the child's chart, right? And anyway, so one yearly thing that's significant is that for the US, we've got, so basically this year we have Saturn doing the second half of Aquarius. 2021 was Saturn in the first half of Aquarius. And in that Declaration of Independence chart, you have the moon of the United States in towards the very end of Aquarius. And Saturn over the moon, it sounds kind of festive. Saturn, transiting Saturn in the sky, going over a natal moon, a birth moon, is usually very rough. It's rough enough that in Vedic astrology, that transit has its own special name, right? Now, very few transits get their own name. That's Sati Sati. And it's basically lots of pain. For an individual, it's rough on health, it's rough on happiness, and it's rough on money, right? And so, it's just a constriction. It's a constriction and pressure and deprivation around the moon, which is where you need to be nurtured, right? Where the food, the comfort, the joy, the ease, where you would most like it to be, right? And so we have the United States just has that tightly for pretty much all the entire year. If you look at Saturn and Aquarius periods for the United States, they all over the last century, they all coincide with economic unhappiness. You have it a couple years into the Great Depression. You have it in a lighter form in the recession in the early 90s and in the early 60s, but it's never like an awesome point, right? And especially now where we have, there's just a lot of damage that's been done that, if you look at a news report, it says, yeah, but look at how great the stock market is. You're like, that's not the economy. Like, there's always a difference between the stock market and the economy, but I think we're all pretty comfortable that there's a much wider divergence than we're used to, right? And so part of the trouble of looking for when the dramatic thing to point at is does the actual drama show up in the same place that we're used to looking for it, right? I'm sure the stock market.
Oh yeah, very good. No,
quite there. I am.
Go.
Sorry,
you're back.
Yeah, this microphone is very finicky. But so there's just like, are we even looking? Do we even know what to look for these days? But that, as sort of a standing wave this year, is certainly not helpful if we're prognosticating about, the economic health of the United States.
Yeah.
Furthermore, when we look at the EU chart, we also have a moon very late in a fixed sign. The EU moon is early 20s of Taurus, and it's almost exactly square Saturn at the end of Aquarius. And that is T-squared by Mars at the end of Scorpio. And so that late pressure.
So yeah, because I got this one ready when we were chatting earlier.
Awesome.
Yeah,
and so you can also see that Saturn getting into the 20s in Aquarius is going to be a problem for the EU as well. Arguably a much larger problem, because we have a lot of tension between that Mars, Saturn, and Moon natally. So yeah, it's right there. It's also interesting to note that the Saturn next year is the official, like, full Saturn return of this iteration of the EU project. It's also I believe it's also the Saturn return of post-Soviet Russia, right? There are a lot, and as Chris was reminding me the other day, this is Saturn Aquarius is also the Saturn return of the public internet, right? So we're seeing a lot of things get their full cycle of inspection.
Yeah, and they, we'll get to the eclipses. Yeah, so the EU didn't have a great 2021, and it's worse. This is a perfect example of next year is the same but worse.
Yeah,
because they also, if you look at where their eclipses are going to land, if you want to Yeah. They've
Well,
got
and
like
let me just say, like, as far as same but worse, right? If you just exerted exactly the same amount of pressure on all the same things, it would be worse, because between between that Saturn-Uranus, Saturn is like, hey, let's do these new rules because things have changed, and Uranus says, I hate those rules. That's not going to work. You have a certain, how should we say, deadlock, where like that some things get done, but more importantly, none of the institutions which are failing to order the things that they're supposed to be ordering are getting fixed. And so the like corrupt or crumbly or just outdated institutions in the midst of that conflict don't get an update, right? Because it's not a radical enough change for Uranus, and it's not as just like solid and programmatic as Saturn would like, right? So things basically just, the longer things stay not fixed but in operation, the worse you get. And again, there's we've still got a debt to pay to 2020, right? A lot of that's still coming down the pipe.
Yeah, very interesting. So let me just stop the share for a sec, because I want to go back to EU and crash, and the Saturn return of the internet seemed interesting to me, because it's the model isn't a model of it's a model of the cosmos rather than a model of markets. It's just that the markets follow the cosmos because they're in the cosmos, right? One of the things that interests me is the from last year, the talk of a cyber pandemic and a cyber polygon in July, which Whitney Webb covered, and also the fact that quite recently, is in last month or in the last couple of weeks, Israel, the US, Germany, Austria, France, Switzerland, Thailand, and a few other countries wargamed an attack, a cyber attack on the financial markets.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know, and they've been doing this for 70 years, they do like to wargame a thing and then do it. And like Event 201 being the most famous example. But if I kind of look at Saturn return for the public internet, trying to create a Great Depression, heading into the end of March, one of the things the premium members have been working on for a year or so is to make sure you have things like notarized printouts of anything, digital assets or mortgages or money in bank accounts or all the rest of it, because we, as you say, we don't know which chickens they are. If it's that chicken, you want to be ready for it, right?
Yeah, well, so that's interesting, because that's I think that's very easy to pin to the Mars retrograde in Gemini during the second half of the year. Well, really, it's Q4, but Mars retrogrades, like they're warming up for a month and a half, and then it's retrograde for a couple months, and then not cooling down, but like how should we say, you're still in the wake of it for a couple months after. So there's 6 month how should we say, they're 6 month sequences, and that's Mars and Gemini. I was doing research on Mars and Gemini previously, and a lot of what I saw was how should we say, simpler than I expected. Historically, there were a lot of problems with epic plane crashes and road closures and trains. It was all of this travel Mercury stuff. And then because you get Mars retrograde in a similar-ish place every 15-ish years, the only, with the internet, Mars retrograde in Gemini we had was the end of 2007, beginning of 2008. That one was half in Cancer, half in Gemini. But the Gemini portion, you had big action by Anonymous, you had big action by WikiLeaks, and I was like, oh, of course, it's information warfare, right? And I think it's probably safe to assume that period sees an uptick in that, between states, between state and non-state actors, between non-state actors and non-state actors. Like, that's just obviously where like that's where the cyber warfare goes, right? Yeah. And so that, I think that's, we can safely locate that. even if we're locating a not so safe spot. I would say that the big cyber attack action in H1 is way less likely than in H2.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
And I would probably stick it in Q4. If I had to bet, I would stick it in Q4.
Good to know. We should talk about, let's do like staying with H1. January, again, Venus retrograde.
Yeah, let's just talk a little bit about the Venus retrograde.
Just
because everybody's going to live with that for a month. So it begins really right now. So, stations, especially of slower moving planets, like it's not that the planet does like a wild high speed pirouette or like a what is it, Fast and the Furious style U-turn, and it's immediately fast in the other direction. It's slow to the point of being stationary. That's why we call them stations. And then just barely starts moving backward through our sky. And right now we're at the station. And so that station will basically take us to the end of January, right? Or will be retrograde until the end of January. And generally speaking, Venus retrogrades they're good pressure tests on new relationships. It's very much, Inanna going into the underworld to, how should we say, be confronted by her sister Resh Kagal. It's the underworld of the Venusian, right? It's where we long for pleasures that are no longer present. It's where we remember desires that we buried a long time ago. It's where, a catalog of all the hurts that have been done to us in past relationships is kept, right? And so, they do a little like turning the heart inside out to see what's there. And they do that with relationships. And because they occur every year and a half, every relationship that's a decade old or 5 years old or whatever has endured a number of them, and they're 5 in a cycle, right? So if you want the complete merit badge, you do 8 years with a person, then you've done all 5. But for newer relationships, it's a good litmus test. Not necessarily like going through it without having issues, but more how do you come through those issues, because you're unlikely to skate through a Venus retrograde. And you probably shouldn't. But yeah, so there's just sort of that, for older relationships, it's just sort of, there may be some dynamics that change. You may need to reassess things. This one being entirely in Capricorn has a very structural quality. Like, what are the foundations of this relationship? What is the structure of expectation on both parties? And is that overt? Have both people stated what they expect and what they are willing to give? There's something, when you mix in the Saturnian with the Venusian, you get a kind of very contractual energy, which isn't the most romantic, but is super important, right? So it's structural reconfiguration.
Yeah, something Kelly said on the water trio, which I really liked, is a rewriting of the rules of engagement, particularly with regard to hierarchies, which again can be, in a really intense sense, what's happening in Austria and Germany, but it can also be, I think we're seeing a lot of that, right? And the risks of permanentizing some of these changes to human behavior, like rewriting the rules of engagement with regards to hierarchy. So there are gatherings you can't do, there are rules around gatherings and all the rest of it. Anything kind of Venusian is getting a hierarchical or structural rewrite, which I think is a good read.
No, I think that you're extending that into the public space social conventions. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, definitely.
And so one thing to note is that, boy, Venus has a really rough time for pretty much all of Q1 and a lot of Q2.
Yeah.
So usually you get this, okay, we did the Venus retrograde, and then it's direct, and then things are sort of normal in Venus land. But this time we get Venus going direct at the end of Capricorn, in the middle of Capricorn, at the end of January. and then is immediately joined by Mars, which is, Mars does not bring peace and accord, right? It's not necessarily bad to have Mars in Capricorn. It's good for martial things. But what you get, because Venus is traveling so slowly after the retrograde, is Mars and Venus move together for about 2 months where they pace. It's like this moving conjunction, which is Mars and Venus together is good for passion. It is bad for peace, right? It's bad for harmony between people. It's good for passion, right? Moments, high highs, but like much lower lows than Venus alone. And when the sort of most particularly miserable moment for Venus is when both Mars and Venus together move into Aquarius, which is like what, Mars 6th, 7th. And then we have Venus, and you'll be able to see this in the sky, visibly sandwiched between Mars and Saturn for like 3 weeks. And so that is that condition, being bodily between two malefics, is in older texts referred to as the planet being besieged, right? Where you're just, it's literally stuck between the rock and the hard place, where that planet has a really hard time doing its thing, right? And Venus's thing is, gilding reality. Just like, it's like, that was a hard day, but here's something sweet, right? Or that was a hard day, but someone still loves you, right? It's those little like relational bits that, tip incarnation into the, hey, maybe it's worth it, right? And so, yeah, we have a really rough period there. What's interesting though is shortly after that, and we're getting towards, I think it's end of April at that point. No. It's beginning of April. The second week particularly, you get Venus ingressing into Pisces, where Venus is super happy. Not only that, but Jupiter is there and Neptune is there. And for a couple of weeks, you have Venus from a like technical astrology position in the best possible circumstances, after being in thoroughly miserable and mediocre at best circumstances for months and months before that. And so that's kind of it's an interesting and slightly wild, or at least very like dramatic shift.
Yeah, definitely. The besiegement, so it's Mars, Saturn, and Pluto in the same time as Venus, isn't it? I see.
Well, no, Pluto's off in Capricorn. Venus spends lots of time with Pluto now.
That's right.
And well, in a fair amount in Q1. What?
Is she conjunct Pluto in January? Is that right?
Yeah. There's let's see. Venus is in the same sign as Pluto from early November to early March. There are multiple periods where they're exact conjunctions. We get 2 of those in December, and then we get another one at end of February, first week of March.
Right. Yeah.
So lots of Venus, Pluto, and then the besiegement, and then Lake of Bliss for a while, and then sort of back to a more normal Venus. Venus is not nearly as dramatically placed once we get done with the Venus in Pisces towards the end of April.
Right. So I think this is why, and it'll end up being weird if we get the low in the Armstrong model for March, and that's right during the besiegement. Then we'll look back when we reconvene in 6 months and be like, well, so that Venus retrograde in Capricorn was somehow like, it's going to be weird, but I'm sure if we come in on a low, and it looks like we will, those 2 stories will be entangled in a way that's going to look obvious in retrospect, as these things usually do. So H1, right, is garbage till the end of March. Then couple of weeks of take a break. If you're gonna have a holiday, have like in Northern Hemisphere, what is that? Spring holiday, spring break.
Yeah,
quite literally.
Yeah. So April, right? So it's April 5th when Venus moves into Pisces. So what's interesting about that is that you've got Venus, Jupiter, Neptune, Pisces, yay! But you also have the Mars-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, perfecting like the day before that and being extremely close. And that Mars-Saturn conjunction is at 22 of Aquarius, which is right near the US moon, and it's right on that EUT square. It's right on the natal Saturn at 23, the natal Mars at 24, and the natal moon at 24 with the EU. So that Mars-Saturn is rough, but then for what reasons we'll see at the time, we also have this lovely like Venus, Jupiter, Neptune thing happening.
So the Mars,
that's the
it's
shots
the urine.
of
Yeah. So you got to drink like, the urine on the 4th, and then the mezcal or whatever you drink on the 5th.
Yeah, well, and that just, we've still got Mars in Aquarius with Saturn for, let's see, until mid-April. So yeah, it's interesting.
It's not a good, I mean, next year is worse. That's just, it's what it is. As you say, higher highs, lower lows, but
yeah,
it's on balance worse. Because typically when humans focus on the things we're going to lose rather than the things we might gain. So if you're talking about lower lows, it's kind of how we roll. Because you get into May, and it's, well, from the very beginning of May, it's eclipse season again. So there's literally like 2 weeks in April to book a holiday.
Yeah. And we also have, during that first part of April, we have the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces being perfect. And that's such an interesting, that's one of the sort of signature combinations this year. Jupiter in Pisces does great work by itself. Jupiter is, it's lucky, fortunate, wise, peace, harmony making, coherence promoting, et cetera, et cetera. And then with Neptune, it's those themes getting taken to a level that may be unsustainable or illusory, or no, it really was great, but don't expect that to keep happening. Just some examples of Jupiter-Neptune times. So when Jupiter moved into the same sign as Neptune in 1945, the World War II was over. The Japanese surrendered within a week and a half. And so it was, yay, peace, right? But the world was still wrecked. An unambiguous good, right? But at the same time, like, that didn't fix all the problems.
Yeah.
Another example I really like that Chris Brennan found was that the first Avatar movie was released during a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. And, you probably remember, it was supposed to be the best thing ever and change cinema forever, and everything was going to be 3D. And, it made a bunch of money, and it was pretty decent to watch once. But it didn't deliver as promised.
No.
Right, it didn't change everything forever. And what was really funny about that example is that I believe the next Avatar is supposed to drop in 2022, which is Jupiter-Neptune time again.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
And so it's this, is it too good to be true? Maybe, right? It might be, and maybe when you encounter things like that, it's because it's easy to how should we say, come in too skeptical and miss what's good.
All right, that's fair, because yes.
So you want to come in with like, okay, so maybe it's not as good as some of these people think it is, but it might be decent, right? It might be worth seeing the movie once, right? But there's sort of maintain a little bit of skepticism without being a total joy kill or buzz kill around Jupiter-Neptune stuff there. There may be some like technologies that are announced that, say they're going to be able to fix X, Y, and Z, and, not quite in practice, right?
There's also a degree of oversensitivity, right? Because I think of Pisces in that, well, as if Pisces, yeah, that's kind of how they roll. And so I am looking for the dark side of it. Like, I'm looking for the expansion.
So the dark side would also be inflation of value. Right, an overestimation of value. If you want to find a configuration that's blowing bubbles, it's absolutely Jupiter-Neptune.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say that some of the things which are being hyped at that point are absolutely bubbles. And we actually get towards the end of the year, we'll get Jupiter back in Pisces with Neptune, and we'll get Mars in Gemini retrograde squaring them, which sounds like a perfect bubble pop.
That's true. Interesting. Okay, but the point's well made, because I am looking for not like the bad side of it, because it's Jupiter in Pisces, for goodness sake, right? So it's a good point. Like, go in eyes open, just because the last couple of years have been the hellscape they are, especially for people in places like Australia or New Zealand or Germany or whatever. It is still Jupiter in Pisces, right? Like, there's still
oh yeah, and from from picking dates to start things or doing astro magic, there are some just perfect moments.
Cool.
But what's funny is that's like right next to the perfect Mars-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius. And one note about that is that when Chris and Lisa and I were looking back at 2021 and looking at, well, what did these Mars-Saturn moments did? For the second two, the one in July and the one in November, that's where we got both of the named corona variants, right? The ones that, well, I guess there are plenty with names, but the ones whose names became successful.
The one that got their own marketing campaigns, yes.
Right, exactly. And so we'd probably want to be looking at those Mars-Saturn times for the winners of the winners of the mutation lottery.
We can potentially hope it is, although this is a whole story of like virology and how you name these things and skip names for political reasons and demonstrate that they exist as separate things in and of themselves. The sort of expansiveness of Jupiter in Pisces, so close to that, may well be a story of something like apparently Omicron being like fine, right? Like, yeah, it's one that you actually would want to expand if it just provides immunity, right? Like, what appears to be happening in South Africa is that it's like it's mild, to say the least. So it is quite literally a cold. And so if you get those two together, and we do get another named one, hopefully. I mean, you can expect the politics to be as avoidant of credible science and risk analysis as it's been so far, but we nevertheless have to live through it. So if you're looking for, as you say, well, here comes another virus with a name, we can cross our fingers that it's highly transmissible in that expanding Jupiter sense, which is good. Like, it's literally good to have a highly transmissible, which is by definition mild, situation, because it brings immunity to large chunks of the population, right? So
yeah. But yeah, I mean, again, as far as like, I don't know, sort of debates and institutions and dissidents and all that, like I don't see any meaningful change in the storyline from 2021. Right, it's kind of it's kind of all the same dynamics, just once more with feeling.
So I don't see it in H1, right? Like, if you actually look at, and I don't think we'll ever get it, because we actually never do. So a good example, one of the things that, in fact, I mean, it happened every year for the last 4 years, but what definitively happened last year, well, this year, because we're still in it, in 2021, was the ultimate dead and buried end of Russiagate, where it's like, this was not just completely fake, but here are exactly the people inside the Hillary campaign that paid for this to be fake. And that came out in the news and everywhere. Like, it wasn't just who I love, like Glenn Greenwald and all the rest of them from the year before. And people still think it, like, people just carry on, right? Like, oh, well, and I don't mean CIA ops like Rachel Maddow. I mean, reality just carries on with people thinking that happened when it actually didn't. Like, I've had conversations with people who go, no, look it up. And you go, oh, shit. And I just kind of think that's how the story's going to end. There's no change in the story. I think we just carry on living in our reality bubbles until maybe November, right? Like,
well, yeah. Well, so that, like that, points at something I've been thinking a lot and kind of trying to figure out how to articulate in a useful way. I think we live in like this period now, this sort of 2020, post 2020 period, the age of air. This first part of it, at least, there appears to be, how should we say, rapid narrative decay, but it doesn't matter. Like there, it's just like, this is the, whatever the big story is, and then and people like that falls apart, and 3 months later there's a news story that fulfills the same sort of structural function. And so the dynamics that whatever story that was abandoned, the dynamics that it played into and supported, they continue just with the new version. And you can just see that everywhere. Like the if you live in the United States or heard anything from the United States during 2020, like the QAnon thing was just everywhere, was huge, and then that just kind of, Trump's going to save us all, and then that disappeared, and then other things appeared and then disappeared, but it hasn't really changed. Like if you look at the United States from like, what are the current conflicts and tensions, like it's all basically the same thing. And then there's stories about what the pandemic is and what it means, and those fell away, and new ones have come in to sort of play exactly the same role. And I think this is this like late Neptune and Pisces stuff where, you just have stories with a really short half-life. But I don't know, it reminds me a little bit of Marx, if Marx is talking about like the ruling class's ideology is just a product of those interests. And so as long as the story is supporting those interests, right, where you have the sort of actual structure of power, just, spinning out stories, in this case, more quickly than it needs to, or more quickly than it needed to in the past, but the result is the same. And I wouldn't say it's merely the ruling class in this kind of somewhat crude Marxist model that needs stories to support its structure. But it's, it's just like, it's a little weird when it's like, hold on, weren't all of you like willing to die for this story 6 months ago? Like,
if you mean, well, that story is certainly not going to change, right? Like, and the Marx, summoning Marx is a good way of framing that, I think, because certainly if you look at the UK and the return of restrictions because of this benign variant, where apparently one person has died of it, but they won't say how old they were, they won't say if they had any comorbidities, and meanwhile the doctors in South Africa are saying no, it's really mild. So they're running with this story. And they're like trying to use it to get mandatory vaccinations in. And Good Morning Britain ran a Twitter poll to say, with Omicron here, is it time for mandatory vaccinations? And the poll got an 89% no. And so they took the tweet down rather than actually address it, right? So I think,
well, and okay, so that's really interesting. And in terms of just like rapid narrative, a time of rapid narrative decay, makes me think of YouTube taking away the boo, the public boo function, right? Like every story just gets to exist, right? And I didn't think I would miss the dislike function, because I rarely like or dislike things like publicly.
Who interacts with YouTube videos?
But sometimes I would feel my critique validated. I'd be like, oh, so good. I'm not the only one who thought that part was kind of shit. But that's sort of, that's definitely like peak late Neptune and Pisces. Right. And one thing that's really important about that, beyond just the we get some Jupiter co-presence in conjunction this year, is that this Saturn-Uranus story, which again, I don't think it gets resolved. I think this just runs until we hit Saturn and Pisces. And then it's Saturn and Neptune in Pisces for 2.5 years. And then both of them go together into Aries, and it's Saturn and Neptune together again in Aries for 2.5 years, right? With Saturn-Uranus, we've got this friction, right? This like very loud, yes, we're going to do this program. This very loud, no, fuck that, we're not going to do that. They're in a 90-degree angle, very tense, very contrary natures. But then we just have Saturn and Neptune kind of being together for years and years and years. And so, that's where this goes. It goes into that like sort of weird, half real,
But that's also like secret police, so it's not great.
That's I don't think you actually, I mean, you could kind of pull it towards that, but I don't think we actually get like if you want to look at like the founding of the CIA or the various letters, which were the KGB or the, any like secret police organizations, you don't see Saturn-Neptune in their founding.
But I think if depending on which part of the kind of vaccine passports, which is infrastructure for a digital currency, which is coming, which parts of that land, secret police might look different then. Like that's like a secret AI police, right? it can potentially get dystopian. I'm not like, this is, and one of the things we'll talk about once we're done with the forecast.
Well, let me add,
because this is a challenging decade.
Well, let me just say, like, first, like, yeah, like there are absolutely dystopian things happening and coming, and part of them, part of the story of the next 10 years is the development of those. But then you also have other things. And so part of with Saturn-Neptune, right? You could, one way to look at it is, Neptune, it's the dream of Saturn control, like the dream of, truly oceanic control. But then the flip side of that is Neptune also dissolves structures on contact. And you have sort of a like, yeah, these are the rules, and maybe a third of people follow them, right? Which is the way that rules dissolve. Rather, Uranus says, no, we need to fight this. Neptune is like, right? Nobody really believes that.
Let's hope it's that. Let's all dream that into being. And I like the idea of dissolving too, because I have visions now of diving on the Ghost Fleet in Chuk, where the ocean is literally dissolving and invading Navy. Like the Navy is now a reef. Like those Japanese ships are still there, they're just underwater and useless. I like that. All right, when we get to in a couple of years time, well, that's the metaphor we're going to take into the Saturn-Neptune era.
Right, and so I think it's such an important way of like framing all of this really tense Saturn-Uranus stuff, which we've got a full year plus of, is where it ends is Saturn-Neptune, which doesn't look like this. And it doesn't look like.
So that's kind of the idea of like there being rules that people don't comply to is historically resonant with, because this totalitarianism, like the EU, I put it at 100%, let's say 90%, that they're going to attempt a digital currency next year. Whether that involves a physical currency cancellation, we'll see. But I think by the end of this, by the end of 22, there will be a digital euro that you use an app with. They might still be euros. But Europe's been through a bunch of different tyrannies over the millennia, frankly. And there's a whole, like, there is a culture of non-compliance, which is like local currencies get built, people swap their goat milk for their baguettes or whatever. And so I do like that idea that at the end of Saturn-Uranus, Saturn-Neptune is a control infrastructure that is not, that has like, that is in a fluid state, right? So it is like, there is the invading fleet underwater. So I think that's kind of useful. I like that idea of, if you think about the last decade or so of the Soviet Union and so on, where there was the official rules and no one, and it was just how people lived. Not that it was a great life, obviously, but the control infrastructure wasn't totalizing. It couldn't be. I think that's,
right. Or in attempting to be totalizing, it was so dispersed and thin that it only, it was only effective like in certain power centers. I was actually just watching some YouTube videos about people in China. It's just sort of a like, what is doing this like? What is doing that like? And there was a lot of like, you can't say anything about, X or Y, but then there are all these other rules that literally nobody cares about and aren't enforced. And whenever you have that sort of a society has or whatever, people have an ambition for total control, it ends up being only in a few like concentrated spots, and the rest is so dispersed that everybody's like, I don't know. I know what to write down on my, my resume, but we both know that doesn't matter.
Yeah. So that would be redolent with the idea that there's not much of a narrative change in 2022. Like but I agree with that if it's that idea that the predator class, just the narrative changes, they will continue to use narratives to push their intention regardless, right? Because what we are experiencing at the moment is the erosion of the previous thing that we were told to be alarmed about and what have you. And I think in that sense, the pandemic narrative, this specific like COVID-19 narrative, I think goes away in that sense next year. Like Armstrong's got a 3-year reaction model. So this would be its 3rd year reaction, which means people may well stop talking about that. We may end up be talking about something else. So I don't know if I don't think it carries on forever. And I don't think it changes in Q1. I think if there was ever going to be like a overturning or a narrative overturning of what's happening, if it was going to happen next year, it would be H2. It would be towards the end of the year. But in that sense, I agree. I think we're kind of at a point where the macro or meta story is rolling on, and that's the story of 2022.
Well, and also, just thinking about now in a longer big cycle sense. We just did the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius at the very end of 2020, basically starting off 2021, and that's like a beginning of a 200-ish year cycle, right? So it's kind of very new territory, and you see a lot of trying out old narratives to see if it matches the terrain, like trying out existing maps. Yeah. And I think that's part of the narrative turnover is like, and we tried that and that doesn't quite match, and we tried this and it doesn't quite match. There are like half matches and quarter matches, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also just like, oh, this is like, this just doesn't, it's like no matter how good you are at studying solid state physics, like if you are in a
not yet.
Back. Sorry about that. Yeah. But if you're studying solids all your life, even if you're an excellent, materials physicist, when you're transferred to the gases department, like there's going to be some carryover, and there's going to be a lot that you just have to rethink. And so I think, and as a somewhat universal, or as a near universal for citizens of this part of history, that there's just going through a lot of old maps and seeing what doesn't match.
Yeah. And which is interesting, because I think one of the things that isn't going to match is how we map make in the first place, right? So like expertise-ism doesn't work anymore. And that is something that, and so that's like one of the meta stories that people can't see if they don't realize that expertise-ism is a story. So the kind of like standing up, sitting down, mask wearing restaurant kind of thing is one of the examples of like experts are idiots. Like there's something's going to happen, but it is not an infallible, and it is not the only way of making maps. And so I'm kind of interested in, because again, if we're talking about triplicities, we're moving from an Earth to an air one. The story of maps of territory is very Earth-based, but it's not quite how you navigate when you can go in any direction. It's not the same sort of thing. It's not, and it's also not knowing in advance what to do and then doing it, which is the story of imperial maps, like sailing around continents, noting every little bay and river and so on, and bringing the boats over. That's not how you sense make or map make in a new triplicity. But I mean, we should talk about frameworks like that, because you mentioned something which is true. It kind of reminds me of Jeff Bezos, which I think is fair. He famously said we're at day one of the internet, and that was about 10, 15 years ago when he said that. But we are year one of we're year one of a triplicity change, right? And that's a couple of 100 years. We'll be in our cold graves, and it will still carry on. And it's sort of important to sit with, as you're saying, like we're trying out new meaning-making modalities, and we're in year one of it. So there's plenty more to go in that sense.
Yeah, and that's part of the narrative turnover. The narrative churn might be a good way to put it.
Yeah, cool. One of the things that we chatted about, which I want to table, because I think we should move into frameworks, because again, there's only so much sugar that can be coated on what we all have to go through in the next 8 or 9 years, even just on an inertial basis. Like, what has been done to the world is unprecedented in the history of human civilization. So like 5,000 years. There's never been this many people who've been locked in their homes at the one time. Like that, we've just raced in the last 2 years through a whole bunch of civilizational firsts that haven't happened ever since the first Babylonian cities, right? So even if everything, which is not going to happen, is done in the space weather, just return to something. We never return to a normal, but more importantly, we've just done all these things. And even if we stop doing them today, the inertial effects of how we live, how we do business, the things we aspire to, and all the rest of it are different just because of the inertia of everything that's been set in play. And so that means there is an urgent need. And I said this in June, which I'm happy with. If you're still on 2 weeks to flatten the curve, this is going to destroy you. This moment's going to destroy you. And then came the passports and whatever. But it's not specifically about the pandemic narrative. It's about everything. It's the engineered supply chain crisis. It's the risk of the total destruction of 2/3 of the world's microchip constructing capacities. Like it's a mess moving forward, even if we all come to our senses right now. So what you actually need is a framework to see that. Like it's the Terence McKenna thing that I open chaos protocols with. Like the problem isn't to find the answer, it's to face the answer. And the answer is we're heading into, just on an inertial basis, stuff that looks very different to anything that you've kind of that's happened before over the next decade. And there's real medicine in frameworks, because if we're all gonna intend to still be on Earth at the end of this decade, then how we understand life and how we move through it and the things we prioritize and value are going to change. And I think when we talk about astrology and longer cycles, there's some available medicine there. What do you think?
Yeah, well, that's, that was a couple mouthfuls. Let me pick some points to respond to. Yeah, on a really simple level, like it's going to take a while to hash everything out. There are new pressures on civilizations. There are new tools. Like day one of like that. I like that day one of the internet. We're at day one, year one of this, and just a lot has changed. And there isn't, the way that civilizations societies get answers they can live with is back and forth and tensions, and do this for a while and that doesn't work and this gets a chance, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's so much that has to hash out, let's say, over the next 10 years. And then especially, if we're looking at the United States, I talked a little bit about the United States having Saturn over its moon this year. But starting in about the halftime show of the decade, Uranus moves into Gemini, and that's 7.5 years, and 7 years. And every time Uranus is in Gemini, at least so far for the United States, which is where it was when the independence was declared, you get a sequence of events that radically reshape the national identity and the United States position in the world, right? So first time Declaration of Independence. And it's worth noting that was right around the time that Uranus was discovered by the human, right? Which is maybe why that's such a signature for the United States. And then second time, or the first, time back, you get the Civil War in the US. And then the third time, you get the United States entrance into World War II. And so that's really interesting, because that Uranus in Gemini doesn't time World War II. No. It times Uranus times the United States entrance in December of 1942 into World War II. And that, of course, again, changes the United States' identity, internal structure, and role in the world. And this is an obvious enough cycle that non-astrologers have literally written books about this. This is the fourth turning hypothesis. They're like, it's 80 something years, and boy, is it important, right? It's like, yeah, no, it's actually exactly 84 years. And there's a 7-year window. And so that's coming up. And so there's no, there's no like looking at what happens politically in the United States this year or next year and be like, well, that's going to settle it into this dystopia, or that's going to settle it into this utopia, right? It's like, no, like the whatever events are going to shake out what things are going to be like stably for a while, that's still just over the horizon.
Totally.
Right. And so I don't know, that might sound alarming, but it's a cause for patience. It's just like, okay, we'll just see how this goes. It also means don't overestimate the importance of things that are happening right now, because this needs 10 years.
That's where I wanted to get, like, if people are expecting their side, whatever their side is, to win, like if you just think once every 5-year-old gets a gene therapy injection, you can all go back to brunch. It's not happening. And vice versa. As far as I can tell, Fauci isn't going to prison. So, like,
right. They're just, yeah,
don't
whatever,
put
like
your side winning, because this is coming back to, like, the narrative isn't going to, this is what we've got. It is this. And there's medicine in that. It's like, don't give energy, and more importantly, anxiety and anger and fear and rage at wanting the world to behave the way you want it to the way your side wants it to, because that's not how it plays out. It cools off, but I think it cools off because people do things like, break up into smaller countries and what have you. But also in general, I just think everyone's going to be living in multiple realities for a while. But there's medicine in, you say it's stark. One of the things that, it's a crude metaphor, but it's sort of fun, that Armstrong used at the conference was, if I tell you I'm going to punch you, and then I punch you, like, that actually gives you time to prepare for the punch. So the sort of idea of looking at what's coming and saying, don't freak out, because yeah, it's not going to be, there are probably more pleasant timelines to be on. But if you know about it, that's the invitation to sit with how you are going to be with that kind of future. What's important to you, what things are probably not going to happen, what can you move away from, what can you move toward? And it's just that kind of medicine of knowing, I guess. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I would, something you were saying about sort of emotional intensity. I think it's really important to remember that, whatever next election or whatever, like next, sort of polarization point in your culture, it's not like the final battle between good and evil, where if you don't conscript yourself and give everything, then, then whatever, a permanent nightmare will descend. Like this is not, this is the, it's sort of the apocalypse, but it's also like it's not Ragnarok. It's not like, it's just that, like, this just goes on for a while, and we'll do that without your input. And, I do think that in terms of thriving during not these times, like this 1 year, right? Because there was a lot with 2020 where you'd be like, well, this 1 year, we've got to deal with it like this because this is, exceptional in a number of ways. But now we have this kind of, it's going to kind of be this way for a while, and it'll change shape, but it's going to take a while to shake out. Not getting overly invested in every development, because that's literally like emotional energy. Your emotional investiture is finite. Yes. And, I'm not saying never invest in anything beyond your selfish little self, but you need to just think about that. Yeah. It's just like, okay, how much am I giving to this versus like, what else could I be investing this, this care into, whether it's my projects or my family or my local community or, whatever.
And that is part of the infrastructure, the sort of psychic infrastructure of control, is to get you emotionally invested in things that are pointless to you on your level, such as the who gets to be president, so that you don't get invested in things that are actually very powerful and empowering, which is, do you know the name of your mayor? Like, do you actually know your sheriff? And can you act like, so Charles Eisenstein asks you to say, well, not what can I do about this, but where can I do something? And if you sit with that as medicine, you no longer get into a yelling match on Twitter about, like, you literally have no input into who is the head of state of a country. But in fact, there are ways in which you are extremely powerful. One, you're powerful above that in a cosmic sense, but two, you're powerful in like a mycelial, local and hyperlocal sense. And we spend all our energy and anxiety, and this is by design, on the one place where we are the least powerful, which is at a sort of like national politics level, whatever your country is. But we found that in Australia, right? So there are people outside of Victoria, and it's slightly different when that happens because this country is out to fucking lunch, particularly Victoria. But there are people in other states who are probably having, you can be outraged, but like an unhealthy reaction to the restrictions that were imposed on Victoria specifically. And it's that kind of like, where am I giving my energy and what am I doing about it where I am? It's been very strange living in Tasmania, for instance, where we've kind of been fine the whole time. And what, like, where can you do something rather than what to do about it? I can't go marching in Melbourne, right? So it's like, where am I giving my energy and how do I be with this moment? Because how we are with this moment, it's going to look different to how we were with previous moments. It's, you know, neutraplicity and all, right?
Yeah. One, you know, this, you know, there, we could say on one level, there's the kind of 10 years to see how it all shakes out. And, you know, half of that is the difference in the global power dynamics now versus 20 or 40 years ago. You know, like what does a strong China look like in the context of, you know, the US, where it's at, and the EU and Russia, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Like things are like, you can't massively change the global playing field and then expect things to instantly click into a new, you know, a new detente, right? Like it takes a while to see, like, you know, countries test each other's boundaries. There will be saber rattling. There may be a few sabers unsheathed, right? Like that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it's important to not, how should I say, either minimize that or exaggerate that into World War III every time you're, you know, a saber rattling in its sheath, because that's going to happen. And that's part of this 10-year thing. But as far as being with this moment, you know, the 2021 moment is basically all of 2022, right? Yeah. Like it's not even, it's, you know, we'd say that the next 10 years is like the quarters of a game. Next year is literally the same quarter of the same game as 2021.
As long as you say it's the final quarter, yes, because if the final quarter in, how to say this right? In the Armstrong model, 2022 is a major turning point across most arrays. So it's not just like looking at a US stock market, it's currencies, it's countries themselves, it's war models, it's plague models. The game continues because we're sort of talking about what happens middle of the decade and towards the end of the decade. By the end of next year, the food shortage and inflation gets very serious, for instance. I think that's one of the things that's a 2023 story more than a 2022. But in order to get to there, this is why I'm like, maybe we'll be done with the virus narrative one way or the other by the end of the year, because there'll be other more urgent things that are coming, is what's in this model. But in terms of the macro narrative, and one of them is the kind of technocracy, interestingly. In terms of like the macro narrative, I agree that the right way of coming into 2022 is to see it as 2021 redux, the reboot, whatever, like the villains are worse. You like the first one, come and see this one, you know, it's the new Ninja Turtles movie.
Hits all the same spots.
Yeah, that in that sense, yes, there is, food gets more expensive, supply shortages get worse, political polarization gets worse, like, but it is, in that sense, it's the same story.
Right, the incompetent institutions do not either they do not crumble to the ground, nor are they, nor are they restored to an ideal functioning.
Yes.
Like they limp. There's a lot that limps on. One of, I think I brought this up last time, but one of my like sort of go-to models for where we are is the West has entered its Byzantine phase, or is in the process of entering its Byzantine phase. People have sort of hyperbolically described the parallels to the fall of Rome as if Rome didn't continue for another 1,000 years. Wasn't the same, but it literally continued. And I think that we're kind of at that point. Definitely. Where just because, you have the end of one phase of Rome, and the West is obviously done with a phase, right? Like there's a 500-year arc. And in many ways, thank God we're done with that. But it just because we're not in the expansionist, colonial, hyper confident nightmare version of the West, it doesn't all just disappear or turn into Mad Max.
No, agreed completely. And I'm particularly interested in the Dark Ages because, anarchists and decentralists generally are, because it's sort of a utopia of decentralization. And the rise of Constantinople. So when the empire was running on two capitals, one of the reasons for moving more and more power to the east was that you could kind of convince the sort of blue blood, the patrician families in Rome, that they were still in charge. These families that all thought they were descended from gods, and grandchildren and grandchildren would sit in the Senate and so on. So they would just kind of sit in Rome thinking it's a real European metaphor, thinking they still had the cultural significance that they once did, whilst the business of running an empire had moved to Byzantium, right, like to Constantinople. So when they're running the two, Rome kind of pretended it was still Rome, but like life actually kind of carried on around them. And as we move into the multipolar world by the end of the decade, I can kind of see that with sort of Washington warhawks still thinking like this up until, let's say, the 70s, you would find the same thing in Britain. So post-war to the 70s, you would, like, basically the Suez Crisis is where I would draw the line for the end of the British Empire, because they sent troops to try and take the canal back and lost. And it's because the Americans didn't back them up. And it's like, oh, I guess we're not those people anymore, right? And
right. Maybe have we actually been LARPing for 50 years?
Yeah. And I think that's kind of Washington's fate moving forward, is to be like, Rome, this is part of your Byzantium metaphor, right?
Yeah.
Like, Washington doesn't get destroyed, but it's no longer Rome. It is Rome, but it's no longer, it doesn't have to fulfill that imperial function, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And also, in the in that earlier Byzantine phase, you had a lot of, it was very common for whoever the emperor was to be like, we're going to make Rome great again. We're going to retake the Western provinces. We're going to, and, it just didn't quite work out. Justinian being the most successful. Justinian's a fun example because he almost restored all of those Western provinces. He kind of did. And then the plague of Justinian hit, right? And this is, a very Age of Air storyline, like empire that's past its due date and be like, no, we're going to do it again. And militarily they succeeded, but then plague, sorry about that. And then, they lost all those provinces instantly because it was terrible. I think it was like, something like 33% mortality in a lot of cities, like just devastating.
Mandate of heaven stuff. And, the Byzantine era for magic was quite good. We sort of ended up with, one way or the other, the grimoire tradition because of it. Like you had Michael Celis, but then you had Gemistof Plethon moving into Italy with his kind of like nakedly pagan Platonism and kind of transforming the wealthy Italian demimonde. So there's like some cool magic that can come out of these times, which is a fun thing for people to look forward to.
Yeah, well, and it's just, and that's, I think that helps frame the environment. It's like, okay, so how do you live in that era?
Yeah. Right.
And it's tricky if you're, if you come of age and sort of get your bearings as an adult in one era, and then it changes when you're, what is it? I was 40, right? When that flipped. right? I thought I had a pretty, I was adapted to my terrain. And then but that's the way it works.
That is
There's always a
exactly.
couple generations that like live during a shift, and you've got to, you've got to figure out the pivot.
Yeah, and that's going to be you. And well, if you're listening to this, it's you one way or the other. I agree. I'm not sure who, if it's like late millennials or early millennials or Zoomers who end up being. I had a friend. Let me back this up. I had a primary school friend who was Australian but born in the US, and his grandmother was, his mother's mother, something like that. I think his grandmother was from the Depression or whatever, and she didn't trust banks. So like, and it was from being a kid during the Great Depression and having banks bust and so on, that he told me like, yeah, my grandmother has all her money in cash in her house. She didn't have bank accounts. She would have been 80, 70 at the time. She'd gone her whole life without bank accounts because of what happened. And I'm not saying everyone's going to be traumatized in that way, but I'm wondering who's going to be like the Great Depression generation. It's probably going to be the Zoomers. They're going to have behaviors that are going to be weird. Like their grandchildren are going to look at them like, what are you doing? What are you doing? In the same way my friend at the time would look at his grandmother like, just use a bank. What's wrong with you? And she's like, I'm not using a bank.
Yeah. I think the next, how should we say, well-adapted generation will be the Pluto and Capricorns, who the oldest of whom were born in 2008, and the youngest of whom will be born in 2 years. They're going to be the like grim little builders who will, come of age in this world and be used to it. They'll, remember a little bit of maybe the 2000 teens as kids, but there's a practicality and I should say an ability to tolerate melancholy, and also, a somewhat architecturally ambitious quality to that generation that we'll see, as this stuff is, as we're getting in much further along into the shakeout period.
Grim little builders is what the West needs. I think that's awesome. I think I'm picturing some kind of like goblins. That's cute. Awesome. Well, if you've got kids who are born post 2008, that's their Halloween costume. Grim little goblin builders. I like it. Cool.
I don't know about goblins, but they're just, I maybe a hard hat would be the cuter thing that conveys the message.
No, I think goblins are cute. I think we could do it.
Okay, well, I guess it depends on the goblin.
True. That's also true. One of the things, I think this is super interesting to talk about, and it's part of what you were just saying about like finding the things that are continuing, like find the version of the narrative, because the macro narratives do continue and some end. But one of them, we spoke about technocracy, and it's complicated, right? So the fourth industrial revolution nonsense we're being subjected to around the world at the moment is a fulfillment and a continuation of this notion of technocracy, which is from the 30s. It's a genuine managerial movement. It believes in, it's the expertise-ism. It believes that the world reaches perfection under scientific management, and that includes all living systems, that includes humans and so on. And it's one of these idiotic ideas that's almost like an 18th century, more 19th century racist materialism, because the subtext of it, it's always been there with the eugenics, and that white management is better. That's how the Anglo-Americans started. That what they wanted was, the idea of the British Commonwealth was white
we can manage
management.
it better than you.
Yeah, white management of a brown planet, right? And that's
right.
Technocracy. It's just that they now don't use those terms, but that's the shape of it. Now, when we're talking about triplicity change, one of the things you mentioned, which I think is really worth discussing, is that's from the 30s. That makes it, we think it's a technology, it's a framework from the era of Earth, not an era of air, right?
Yeah.
So go on.
Well, and if you think about just the nature of those substances, right? Earth is organizing. Right? You build structures. When we say structure, we generally mean a thing made of solids. We don't mean the pattern of currents in the ocean, right? We don't mean the a set of weather currents, right? There's structure to those, but it's not the same. And if you expect the same level of predictability that you get with bricks, with air currents, you'll be very unhappy. And you can manage bricks in a way you can't manage air, right? Doesn't mean that there are no ways to affect it, but it's different. And I also think this idea of sort of by managing the physical, we can manage everything else. Is that only, how should we say, that the credibility for that depended on a series of industrial revolutions, which were at least materially better in some ways, right? Now we can farm twice as much with the same number of people. Now we have this, and we can, go faster in cars than in horses, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that there's an unspoken expectation in culture, especially Western culture, but not just Western culture at this point, that some new invention is going to come along and change everything, and in a sense, save us from our current condition. And I don't think that's going to look true. Doesn't mean that nothing new will be invented, but if you extrapolate out like what already exists, and yeah, there'll be VR stuff, and there'll be a lot of refinements and incremental improvements in what we're doing, but I don't know that we're going to get anything that fundamentally changes power dynamics in the same way that what we've already been through does. And that if you sort of notice that assumption that, oh, we'll just invent our way out of this, it places you much more squarely in the present. Yes. Where it's like, oh, how do we deal with this with the tools we have, rather than just like, fingers crossed, they're going to be amazing new tools, right? Yeah. Doesn't mean that we can't take our current technologies and use them to solve problems much more effectively than we are right now. But that's a different thing than that. Again, that sort of unspoken assumption that something's going to just change it all. We're not going to have to worry about it.
Yes.
And also, I like what you said about management, right? Because, we can manage the bricks, but like the sun manages the earth, right? There are a lot of things about the physical environment that manage us, and they can't be bossed around with a microphone and like a little corporate badge.
Agreed. And that's the important part, because you look at it, it allows you to see the this glorious technocratic future is as stupid as a Jetsons comic, right? And from the same time, and it is a belief in physical mastery, and that's real. That's the outgoing triplicity. That's not the one we've got whatever it is, a couple more centuries left of it to go, and that's quite encouraging, right? If you're facing these kind of like, you will own nothing and be happy, and like you can rent out your living room for corporate hustles or huddles, and get in a car you don't own that's automatically driven to take you to go and buy your bug meat for your children. This is just, that's the Jetsons, right?
That's also like almost right now.
Yeah.
Right. That's almost 5 years ago too.
Yeah.
Like that's not like, how should we say, you don't have the like totally clean powered, little like cars from the Jetsons, like things are still, there's still mountains of human waste produced right there. It's not, we're still going to have the same old problems that human beings have always had.
Yeah.
Right. And likely we'll not figure out how to create free unlimited energy. Right.
So
maybe we'll get more efficient, but it's like, it's still going to be finite and worth fighting over.
Yeah. Well, this is the kind of big point that you were mentioning when we were doing the planning call, is you might immediately associate the idea of like runaway innovation with the triplicity of air, but it's better off understood as the one we've just been through, that did in fact reorganize the planet and what happened.
Yeah, and none of the previous ages of air were runaway innovation. They were their air is much better at distributing, right? And like I said the other day, it reminded me immediately of the William Gibson quote from like 20 years ago, which he said, "Oh, the future's here. It's just not evenly distributed."
Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of good. If you're, again, this comes back to the sort of framing about what the narrative controllers want to happen and how they're describing it and what's actually going to happen. Like, we get to live in those gaps, and it's all intelligence to kind of come back to how what you choose to prioritize and how you choose to live and with whom and according to what values that we're looking at for the next decade. But I think you can use this Venus retrograde to look at that values, like on a personal basis, right?
Oh, so, absolutely. Venus retrogrades are awesome for what do I really care about?
Yeah. So guys,
underneath it all.
Yeah, Venus retrograde in Capricorn. What do I really care about now that we're in a non-Earth-based triplicity? Let's just teed it up for you. Anything else there wasn't like anything else just before we do the questions? We didn't get to June. We got to the eclipses in May.
Yeah, just, I mean, a little, yeah, we should spend a little time on that, right? So the May eclipses actually start on the last day of April.
First day, right? In Australia, it's May 1, but yeah.
Right. So, whatever, right? So it's a solar eclipse in Taurus. It's right next to Uranus. It pings the Uranus-Saturn square again, right? So it's all the same stuff. Again, we've done this Uranus-Saturn square getting set off a bunch of times. So it's another iteration of that. And then the one in Scorpio 2 weeks later, it's just the other side of that. It's the same Uranus-Saturn thing, right? And so what does the Uranus-Saturn thing look like? It looks like civil unrest. It looks like another, how should we say, a hot point in cultural debate about what do we do about now, right? Are these the rules? No, we hate those rules. It's that again. It's just that again. And then it's one thing that's worth noting is a little bit after that, on May, where is it? Looks like May 11th, Jupiter actually goes into Aries. And so this year we have Jupiter doing a couple signs. As we begin 2022, Jupiter will have just gone back into Pisces, did that for a couple months in 2021. So it's Jupiter in Pisces from the beginning of the year until early May, and then it's Jupiter in Aries. And it's going to be Jupiter in Aries until the last 2 months of the year, where we get a dip back into Pisces just in time for November. And so whereas Jupiter in Pisces is very archetypally Jupiter, it's big, it's oceanic, it's coherent, it's spiritual, et cetera, et cetera. Jupiter in Aries is Jupiter supporting, how should we say, the confident, the bold, the warlike, the strong. If Jupiter is a teacher, right? Jupiter in Pisces is a very archetypal teacher who has wisdom, et cetera, et cetera. Jupiter in Aries is very much the martial arts instructor. I made a joke the other day. I was thinking of the Kill Bill movies where the main character flashes back to her training. And the old guy, Pai Mei, grabs her fist and he's like, if this is my fist, I want it to be strong, and starts her like punching, doing like a fist hardening exercise on some thick slabs of wood. It's that kind of support. It's not soft, but it's not a bad place for Jupiter, but it's much more, it's a much more martial teacher. It's a support for boldness. It's a support for confidence. It's a support for becoming, as strong as you want to be and as fearless as you want to be or need to be.
Very cool. Very cool. Anything else then from June? One of the things, actually, just to go back to the eclipses, which Cass Tyndall said on the water chair, something I quite liked, which is you could think of them as, in Taurus and Scorpio, it's the opportunity of navigating between and releasing between simplicity and complexity. So what's too complex, what's overly complicated in your life, or and use those as it's like an axis of between complexity and simplicity to think of, depending on where it's hitting. And where they hit for me, that works.
Yeah, that works for me. With Uranus there, simplicity is kind of the new innovation.
Yeah.
Right. It's like one of the limits, the sort of limits of technocratic ambition, which we've experienced on this podcast, is that when you get to certain levels of, when you get to extremely high levels of complexity, the number of breakpoints grow exponentially as well. And so, the most sophisticated things are also the most fragile, right? I was joking with you the other day, this microphone, which is vastly better than 3 or 4 other microphones I own, also like gets knocked out of alignment 10 times as often.
Yeah.
You're on your not as good camera because the good one had an unforeseen problem.
Well, yeah, and it's crazy. It's just mental. And also this MacBook is newish, a year old, and quite expensive. It had to get made in the slave factory in Taiwan rather than off the shelf in Australia. And the Wi-Fi doesn't work now unless I run diagnostics and then it accidentally finds it. And I'm like, can't you idiots get something right? But yes, it's a complexity, simplicity. Whereas that GoPro, you can drive a truck over it, works a treat. And
yeah,
there you go.
When that's part of the Uranus, the revolutionary being in Taurus, right? It's like, actually, maybe the 99-cent pad of paper is a better way to take notes than the like complex voice to text translation function on your phone.
I couldn't agree. My experience of Uranus and Taurus, because obviously it's coincided in a significant part by having a farm. So the innovations that we've had here have all been permacultural, and like rainwater tanks and geodesic greenhouses and all the rest of it, that are just the most perfect technology is as simple as possible. So anything that, and it doesn't like, so the best space shuttle is also the simplest space shuttle, but like the best anything from a technological perspective. So I agree, like Earth-based innovation doesn't need to be a 4th industrial revolution. It can be a geodesic greenhouse.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, and I mean, that level of it's very Nassim Taleb, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, take into account the fragility complexity relationship, because in some areas of life it's worth, like, how should we say, becoming the team of experts that's necessary to keep that complex fragile thing running. But you can't do that in every area of your life with everything, right? Absolutely. Like figuring out what you can keep simple and still get lots of benefit from is economical in terms of your time, your energy, like what, your mental space.
And yeah, I mean, releasing the things that are, especially if they've become progressively complicated. So Catherine Fitz has a big thing about shadow work, which is over, I mean, she's, I think in her late 60s, whatever she is now, but over the course of her lifetime, we pay more and more. She's observed you pay more and more for something and you get less and less services. So if you think about going to a grocery store when she was a kid versus now, not only is everything 20 times the price, but you have to bag your own groceries. And that's shadow work. So that's actually like offloading corporate complexity and cost onto you. And so the opportunity in a complexity, simplicity dialogue is to work out what things can you get rid of that like can improve your life. Like, is the tax code now too complicated for you as a small business owner to kind of submit your own tax files, and do you now need an accountant, or what version of that is there for you, right? Like, it would definitely, yes, that is, like, there's only one answer to that: get a fucking accountant for sure. But that language of like, how is my life, what the eclipses can do in that sense, it's like, well, what can I release from my life that's too complicated? And I like that. I think that's a really good way of being. That's how I'm going to be with it.
Yeah. What just to use the note-taking function, right? Like what apps on my phone actually are done better without a phone at all? And then what are things that I can't do without the fancy device, right?
Grinder. All right.
Right. But the notebook is probably not going to be, I mean, I guess
good.
I like to imagine you with paper airplanes, right? Just
Nice one. All right. Anything else for H1 before we jump to the questions?
I don't think so. I would just, I said a little bit before, but shortly after that, May 11th ingress of Jupiter into Aries, we get the Mars moves in about 2 weeks later on May 24th. And so we've got that for the rest of H1, that Mars Jupiter, right? Which again, on the like geopolitical stage will look like saber rattling. But on a personal level, that's good energy for just getting a ton of things done, for having like a short, even if we're using war metaphors, like it's a 6-week campaign. It's not a long war, right?
Yeah. Cool. Good. All right. That's like get in shape for summer. There you go. Good.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So question the first, when will the food shortages start? They kind of already have, but if you mean from the Armstrong model, if you mean when they get serious, it's a 2023 story showing up end of next year. You're going to start seeing proper inflation end of next year.
I mean, food in the United States is inflated significantly in the last 6 months.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, shortage is going to show up like first as inflation.
Yes.
And it's going to get wildly inflated. It's not inflated, it's the actual value of the thing, because there's, it's the actual value of the beef because the demand for beef is the same and there's half as much beef, right? So technically it's not really inflation. It's inflation that the prices get bigger, but we're already getting that. And so when you're tracking, like that's what food shortages look like in places with a lot of infrastructure, right? Is they look like climbing food prices. And then for places that are further away from supplies of food, it looks like actual empty places in the shelves.
And it's also, and the other side of that is there are places where it won't show up. So at the moment, still just over half the world's food supply is made by small farmers. So if you actually think about a country like Ecuador, which is all organic, by the way, like their food is amazing, but they don't have an engineered supply chain crisis off the California coast, and they don't eat that stuff, right? So if you're in a network of small farmers, it's going to look more or less, you're not going to have shortage-based inflation because there are not going to be any shortages.
Right. One that's really interesting because it literally shows you what's local and what's not.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Like the prices will show you. I mean, they've always reflected that to some degree, but that's been really minimized, and we're coming out of that minimization.
Yeah.
If you want fresh avocados in Alaska, it's you're going to have to pay for that. If you want fresh avocados in season in California, you need to walk outside, right? Because your neighbor probably has a tree.
Yeah, that kind of thing. But yes, it's a 2023 story, like serious inflation in 2023 and serious.
I think we get a lot of it in 2022.
Yes. Oh yeah. Well, as you say, like it's literally already happened. Like this is in the US in particular, it is the quarter on quarter cost of living is the fastest spike or fastest growth in like 60 years, right? So that doesn't turn around ever, but it does mean in this model anyway, by 2023 is when you're looking at $40, at least temporarily, $40 sticks of butter and that kind of stuff. Like it gets real bad for some things but again, that's inertia. If you're looking at what the Great Resetters are trying to do to the food supply to get everyone into that eating bugs, it doesn't work, but we have to go through that mess, right?
Well, and it happens without that sort of input as well, right? Like part of it is just structural. Like these, we have highly complex, fragile networks, and you get any disrupt, to a certain degree, or to a certain degree, you can just look at pressure being put on a lot of these societies, America, for example, for the first time in a while, and the ability to respond is semi-pathetic. Right, like these are fragile systems, and there was fragility revealed. They're also bad actors, but just from a structural point of view, we're also just looking at fragilities revealed, and then of course exploited. But like there's just that there with the structure
and the incompetence of not being able to do anything other than the plan, right? So a sizable chunk of the infrastructure-based shortages in the US is because of attempted mandates for truck drivers who don't want the injections. And if you double down on that, people run out of food. So it's that's what I mean by that you can call that structural, or you can call that managerial, if you will.
Yeah, well,
what happened.
I would say, yeah, I'm including the managerial in structural, like the way that, logistics are dealt with in a given society or nation or whatever.
Yeah. There is nevertheless a deliberate hit on the kind of like just-in-time logistics, that because it's perceived that, we should be eating bugs and we shouldn't be going on holidays, and that's kind of what you get at that technocratic eugenic planning level. So, yeah, there are ways, like for the membership, we've been exploring ways for now 18 months where you can grow more of your own food, can more of your own food, make sure you have stuff that is supplied and so on. Because what I find fascinating and grim about facing something like supply chain disruption and shortages and all the rest of it, including inflation, is it's one of those economic activities that you can't not take a position on. You can't not take a position on inflation. It happens. So you can't be like, oh, I'm not really financially sound, I'm not really interested in economics. It's like, well, you have to eat. Like, that's too bad. Like, to not take a position or not prepare for it is to take the position that you think everything's going to be fine, and that the management of your food infrastructure is okay, and you're happy to go along with how everything's going. Now, that might be the case if you live somewhere like Vilcabamba in Ecuador, but if you don't, if you live somewhere where you've been going into Walmarts and seeing like aisle after aisle of campfire chairs opened up because they haven't had stuff delivered and they're trying to make it not look empty, then you need to be thinking seriously about what does that look like for you, and just that kind of peace of mind of like, just have some food somewhere in the house, because it's not, we don't run out of food as a civilization, right? But you actually might go like a while, let's say 70 hours, in a worst case scenario without food. Or like, what would you do is a better way of saying that. Like, what would you do if you couldn't get food for 70 hours? Would you be okay? Would you fast, or do you have enough food in the house to deal with something like that? And it's worth people spending some time on, because it's the unpredictability of what's going to happen. You don't want to be caught in one of the bad places, I guess.
Yeah, well, and it's I'm just reminded of when we first moved out sort of into the country about 2.5 years ago. And I was talking with some friends, and they're like, oh, are you going prepper? And I was like, no, I'm going 15%. I was like, I just want to be prepared for, if things get rough for a couple of weeks, gets a little wild for a couple of weeks, right? Because the chance of that happening over the next 10 years, very high.
Very high.
The chance of total societal collapse,
Lower.
Greater than zero, but very low, right? But in terms of what I'm going to spend my time preparing for, do I have 96 cans of Costco chili in the basement? I do.
Yeah. That's how this is kind of like, if you can see, if you have a framework for the next decade, it involves things like that. It's not prepping, it's risk management. Right?
Yeah.
It's the right way of approaching it. All right, next question. Would love to hear about the color Sarpa we just went in.
So the Kala Sarpa is a combination. Kala Sarpa Yoga is a combination Vedic astrology. That's Kala Sarpa is Sanskrit. It basically means time serpent would be a translation. And Sarpa is Sarpa and Naga are sometimes used interchangeably, but Naga tends to be more of like a wiser, better intended sort of snake energy, whereas Sarpa tends to connote a more, it's more like I never trusted him, he was a snake, right? Like a venomous, treacherous sort of snake energy. And so a Kala Sarpa yoga occurs when all of the planets are on one side of the nodes, the head and tail of the dragon. So if you look at a chart and you drew a line between the head and tail of the dragon, Rahu and Ketu, right, you'd have you have a almost perfect 180 line. And if you have all of the planets on one side or all of the planets on the other, that's what forms a Kala Sarpa Yoga. And when that's interpreted natally, basically means.
See, my camera also does that. It also, if you bump it, it switches off. I think that's probably what happened. Anyway, carry on.
Sorry, I'm back. I just pulled the cord out.
All good.
I was gesticulating. But what that means is that for that person, everything is, in a sense, between the head and the tail. It's in the belly of the beast, right? And if we're looking at the Rahu and Ketu, we're talking about the eclipse dragon energy. And eclipse energy, causes things to pop out of nowhere and to surprise you. It causes the latent to become apparent, and also makes the apparent disappear overnight. It's like, eclipses have a very quick change energy, things out of the depths and back into the depths with little warning. And so generally it means that, it's interpreted as a bad luck thing. Like things just don't go right for reasons that can't be seen, right? With eclipses, we're always looking at, we're always literally looking at what is supposed to be either the sun or the moon at its brightest, and then suddenly it's overshadowed, right? So we're looking for things that can't be foreseen or that move in an invisible, we'd say underworld sort of space. And so when a person has Kala Sarpa, it means that a lot of the bigger events in their lives will be things that they have less control over, right? And so we've had sort of on and off Kala Sarpas over the last couple of years in the skies, more than usual. And so that's, I think that's everything I just said about the natal is a pretty good description of the last couple of years, where it's like, what's going on? I can't see exactly what this is or where it's going. When do I, I feel, I know I got devoured by the dragon mouth. When do I get pooped out the tail? Right? Like there's all of those difficulties. And a lot of times Kala Sarpa's thought to ease up significantly when a person gets to their early 40s and they hit the maturation of Rahu. At least that's what I learned in the tradition that I learned it in.
Interesting. Yeah, cool. That is definitely the last.
Actually, so one quick anecdote. My favorite Kala Sarpa having nativity of all time was a client that I read for. He's a very creative person who had literally, without knowing that he had this in his chart, had built a giant dragon to do spiritual work inside of.
Cute.
And I was like, that's exactly what's in the chart. And I was like, you're awesome. Like they just intuited that, like, no, this is my situation. I'm going to work from here.
Yeah, fair enough. I like it. All right. I'm curious how you would grade this Saturn-Neptune hot take. The all-seeing eye gets increasingly obsessed with its Twitter feed while the rest of us get on with our lives.
Sure. I don't disagree.
There you go. All right. Next one. Could you elaborate on the US Pluto return next year and the possibility, question 2, the possibility of a Mercury retrograde dancing with Pluto in Feb?
Yeah. So, just like with a Saturn return, we can look at the day when Saturn is exactly conjunct natal Saturn, but it's often more meaningful to look at it as the 2.5-year period where Saturn's in the same sign as natal Saturn. From a, there's a moment way to look at it, and then there's a phase way to look at it. Looking at it from the phase sense, the US Pluto return is from early 2008 until 2025, right? We are approaching exact hits to the natal position, and I think it's so everywhere that it's hard to see. If I'm looking at the US natal Pluto in that And I'm back. Okay.
Nice.
Sorry about the editing you're gonna have to do on this.
Oh, I'm leaving him in. Fuck it.
So if we're looking at the US Pluto in that chart, right? It's in the second house in Capricorn. So second house is money stuffs. And with, it's Capricorn. It has to do with hierarchies. The decan is the third decan of Capricorn. It's very hierarchical. I abbreviated it as a throne. The sort of bigger decan, or the bigger images, it's the person behind the big desk, right? That's the third decan of Capricorn. And so Pluto is, things which have power but are concealed. And, there are probably other good takes on this, but I really tend to think of the US Pluto as being about the sort of secret class structure in the United States. The US is like, especially when it first began, its whole, like, what was appealing about the new model was that you wouldn't have hereditary class structure in the same way that, you did in most of the world at that point in time, certainly in most of Europe. And, it's become pretty clear that, like, the US has sort of grown a landed nobility without titles. And I think people are just enraged by how obvious it is at this point. And one of the how should we say, what's the word, initiatory moments was right after that ingress in 2008, where we saw how those who were responsible for the financial downturn were treated, which was and how were they treated? They were treated very respectfully. And those, those companies were bailed out. And, it was sort of like, hey, that's not how it works for me or other people I know. And, those tensions are just sort of underneath everything, right? The, like, knowing that, like, there's a very real class system where people are treated very differently. Depending, and it's mostly a class system that money buys entrance into, right? It is in the second house, and it just couldn't be more obvious at this point. I think that's something that people left, right, center, up, down, east, west, like, everybody agrees on that. It's just, what to do about it is the bigger question.
So, like, the actual, like, the full return, like, or I guess the conjunction, the Pluto-Pluto conjunction is, do you think that's just the self-evidence of it? Or you don't think that's guillotines? That's just like, well,
no,
it's a revelation of the class structure.
Well, if we didn't have the big Uranus and Gemini 7 years coming up, I think it might be, not that it's not a big deal, but it would be a bigger deal. But it's really that Uranus return, just, it's going to change everything anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
That's true.
Terms of, it's sort of like, yeah, that matters, but, like, it's a little bit, it's outshined a little bit by the fact that Uranus ingress into Gemini is just a few years off.
So if it was the even if it was the attempted solidification of the private jet class as the only people who could move around the world.
That's a good way to put it. I like that.
Yeah, it wouldn't last that long anyway. So if it's like, okay, no one's allowed to travel on planes anymore. Like, what happened in the EU this year was the imposition of carbon taxes on air travel, excluding private jets, right? And of course not. And that's because it's us they don't want traveling. So even if that had happened, even if, not that the US would do this, but even if there was like the public revelation of, like, you're only allowed to travel through the air if you have your own jet, it'd still only last a couple of years anyway because of the Uranus return coming up. Like, yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an intensification. It's such an intense look at how those sort of, that, like, how should we say, those underworld hierarchy structuring mechanisms work and have worked in the United States, right? And that's entangled with racial policies. It's entangled with all sorts of things in the US. It's it's a big thing. And what's interesting, not to spend 20 minutes on this, but what's interesting is in the US, in that US chart, it's exactly opposite Mercury, right? So it's always, so you see that Pluto exerting like an invisible control on the Mercury, the discourse, right? Which, you know, you can see it now, but it's sometimes history, it's easier to see things because you're not inside them. It's like, oh yeah, that like the that like infinitely heavy but tiny Pluto exerting that gravitational pull over like discourse and what gets said in the United States.
Yeah, I like it. Cool. Next one. When are the best times to try and escape Australia, given that leaving has been a challenge to say the least? Also, when is the worst time when I should definitely be gone, lest I get stuck? Bear in mind, I won't personally be ready to go until probably March.
That's okay. So um I would say not during the Mars-Saturn in Aquarius period, which is like what, March 6th through April April 14th. Yeah, no Mars Saturn, no Mars Saturn together, right? I think what you'll get is whatever like Saturnian ordering, law enforcing things get nastier when Mars is co-present there. So I would say before or after then would be one sort of easy parameter. Let's see. Yeah, there's a fair amount that depends, right,
Yeah.
On your own situation,
That's
right? Because
like,
all you need is that little bit of personal luck. You don't need to
that's
like change the way laws are written or enforced over a continent.
it's
But yeah, I would just avoid that.
that kind of like the best time to plant a tree is 100 years ago. The second
Yeah.
best time is today. Like the best time to get out of a country that closed its borders in violation of all human rights law for almost 2 years and may well do it again is as soon as you fucking can, right? So, but and if you can't time it before March, then because actually, yeah, if you can't time it before March, it's as soon as you can get out, if you can get out, if that's what you're doing. I know a bunch of people who are. All right, what happens with the housing market in the US in 2022? And also, what books would you suggest going into this new year? Well, hopefully mine will be out. It was supposed to be, well, it will be, but this fucking year and the disruptions to it. So I'm going to recommend Animistic, available sometime in the dumb quarter, Q1. Anyway, housing market. What do you think? Oh yeah, well I'll go first then. It's going to get the same thing that all real assets are experiencing inflation, right? And that includes, depending on the property class, that will continue as money tries to get out of countries other than the US. So a lot of money coming out of Europe into the US at the moment, and a lot of money coming out of bonds, because they're attempting to re-engineer how governments are financed around the world. And so there's only, and the bond market itself is huge. So there's a whole bunch of money that has lost faith in the whole planet and is aware that bonds are ending and is looking for places that carry less risk of a downturn in the short term of the stock markets. So like, it's not just houses, it's first edition Spider-Man, it's Picasso's, it's anything.
It's the Uranus and Taurus. It's the things.
Yeah. So there is no crash in housing as far as I can see in 2022.
Yeah, I bet there'll be cooling because there was a certain frenzy. But I mean, you know, real estate, I think, and you know, I'm not an expert in economics or housing markets. But you know, there might be some cooling off, but I don't think, for example, that in general, most markets aren't going to lose the majority of what they gained, right?
Yeah.
They'll still be, even if they cool off, they'll still be up from like pre-2020, because houses are just, you know, I mean, and that there will be exceptions to that, like, you know, in certain parts of cities that have had a tremendous amount of trouble over the last couple of years. But you know, for most of, you know, the U.S. housing market, I think a lot of houses will retain value or continue to grow.
Well, yeah, because there's a bunch of stuff going on. It may depend on where you are, of course, and because the US doesn't really have, because there are 50 states, Like, if you have a $5 million plus house in San Francisco, I don't know if you would get 5 million for it at the moment, because the city is fucked. Similarly, if you have a normal suburban house in somewhere like New Jersey or Illinois, the exit taxes and taxes in general around property that are going up means that you have to convince someone maybe from out of state to not just pay what you want for the property, but live in a situation where the cost of owning property there is higher and higher. But if you look at, there are houses and apartments in Florida that are going for 100,000 cash over asking on the day they're listed. So it depends where you are in the US. If you've got a, yeah, and there are places, similarly, and consequently, there are places I would and wouldn't buy property in the world in general. But the other thing that's happening is you have large institutional investors like BlackRock moving into the US housing market in preparation for that you will own nothing and be happy world. So you've got people, you've got organizations and hedge funds who are buying 5,000 houses at a go, right? And that's because the plan there is to have them available in a UBI system. But that just puts a whole bunch of additional demand into a market that has previously been for like families who want a roof for their children. And
yeah,
so,
well, and that's in addition, it's also just the, institutional investors are just showing you where they think money will be safest.
Yeah, quite literally safest houses in the right places. Cool. It's wild times. Is this the first time, I might be putting you on the spot here, I don't know if you've looked, is this the first time Uranus has been in Taurus when we've moved out of an Earth triplicity?
I don't know.
It's just the perfect way to add drama and spice to like the end of the Earth and beginning of air, is to have it be like, whoa, at the same time.
Yeah, well, and then, we get the Uranus into Gemini, in addition to whatever US stuff, is also like, as we've talked about before, the middle of the decade, we get Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto all switched into new signs. And we'll have both Pluto and Uranus in air. It'll be Pluto in Aquarius and Uranus in Gemini until the early 2030s. And then Pluto will still be in Aquarius for another 10 years after that. But that's that Uranus in Gemini, Pluto in Aquarius is very cyberpunk nightmare fantasy. Yeah. Like that's when it's not just a great metaphor that fits. That's when it, I think, fully looks like it.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Related, and we did sort of answer this one, but are there any spots in 2022 that look like a widespread cyber attack grid down scenario? The World Economic
Forum. Yeah, again, if I'm going to put it somewhere, it's the Mars retrograde in Gemini, which is Q4.
Yeah. The only thing, that's where it looks astrologically. If that Israeli event, well, so Cyber Polygon happened in July and we didn't get it. So the Israeli scenario planning of attack on a financial system happened a couple of weeks ago. So that's kind of like event 201. So if it's like within 3 to 6 months of like one of their endless scenario plans, then it's Q1. But astrologically, as you say,
I mean, that's what it looks like. I haven't exhaustively researched it, and we're probably not going to find a lot of precedents, right? For what is basically a novel form of conflict.
Yeah, true. Is there something astrologically that speaks to a big spike in house prices? Yeah, Uranus and Taurus. And that's all right.
It's the real things, right? That's the whole like, oh, maybe the best repository of value is not this complex and new financial instrument. Maybe it's just having a thing I can live in. Yeah. Maybe it's having 100 pounds of beef in the freezer, right?
Always good. Yeah. All right. What's Austin's most delectable electional moment of H1 2022?
Well, I would say, generally speaking, you want to look at the sweet spot where Venus is done with the brutal co-presence with Mars and Saturn and moves into Pisces. And so that's April 5th. And that begins several weeks of really beautiful Venus-Jupiter elections. There's just some really good stuff there. It was to that point last month in my classes. The students had electional assignments, like, we went over Dorotheus's parameters for when to get married, when to schedule a surgery, a couple different things. And so everybody had to, like, I think it was up till the June solstice next year, find me your best time that fits these parameters. And like half the charts were the second week of April,
Right.
because there's so much you can do with that Venus Jupiter.
All right, there you go. Well, that's actually a good question to end on. So thanks very much to everyone who has sent in all the questions and the lively chat that carried on as we were chatting. And any I don't know, parting words for H1? Anything we want to leave people with?
I don't know, something like, well, just keep on and carry on, but more eloquent and inspiring than that. Like the eloquent, inspiring version of that.
Just pretend we said it.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah.
It's just more of the same. Like you already did a year of it, and you'll probably be, unlike the world, you'll be better at it next year.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. All right. We'll end with that. Well, thank you, sir. Anything you want to talk about you got coming up?
Oh yeah. So for first half of next year, Phases 2.0 will be out. Absolutely. Hopefully maybe during that second week of April, we'll see. Getting really close, but there's still a lot of work to do. I will have a self-paced version of my year 1 classes. It'll be self-paced, but with like some live tutoring stuff, so people get feedback. That will be out in January. I will be teaching my year 2 and year 3 classes. We'll start those in April, but you got to pass year 1. There's also Sphere and Sundry, for which I am the chief electional officer and consigliere. And Kate did some really magnificent series in 2021 that haven't yet seen the light of day. Let's see, I think Q1, as a counterpoint to Q1, there will be an absolutely gorgeous Venus series that will be released.
Cool.
One of my favorite Venus elections ever. And there'll be a couple other things. There's some nice fixed star stuff coming up. There's this and that. I'm not sure what order things are going to come out in, but keep an eye on Sphere and Sundry. And yeah, I think that's what I've got going on.
Nice one. All right. Well, thank you. And again, thank you everyone for listening and watching and participating. And however you celebrate it, have yourselves as best as possible holiday season.